So why do we get sick? Randy Ness came up with 6 evolutionary explanations for why humans are vulnerable to disease. The first is that natural selection is a pretty slow process, and it's particularly slow when you consider that humans don't evolve nearly as fast as our pathogens. So pathogens have much shorter generation times and evolve very quickly. In addition to that, natural selection lags behind environmental change. Humans are great at changing our own environment. And so this means that we have traits that have been selected for a particular environment that doesn't exist anymore. And this leads to something called mismatch. Selection is not a one-size-fits-all solution. There are trade-offs. So sometimes you can't have wings and arms, right? You can have one or the other. And so knowing that selection can't solve all problems, understanding how trade-offs work, and that a species' evolutionary history can put constraints on the potential changes that natural selection can bring about is a really important part of evolutionary medicine. And as we talked about with the Alzheimer's example, we often misunderstand what selection is actually shaping. And so this 5th bullet here, some traits increase the reproductive fitness at the cost of increasing vulnerability to disease. This is antagonistic pleiotropy like we discussed. And, sometimes what might appear to us to be a disease is actually an adaptation. And so for this video, we're going to go through these big topics with examples. And so first, selection is slow and pathogens are fast. And so our pathogens and our parasites include bacteria, viruses, fungi, worms, protozoans. And just like us, all of these things evolve. And because they're much smaller and they live in much larger population sizes, they evolve much, much faster than us, than their hosts. And so generally, pathogens are small, they reproduce quickly, and for an example, HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, goes through 300 generations in a single person in 1 year. That's a lot of generations. HIV evolution within a single patient is demonstrated in this graphic over here on the lower right. And you can see that the different genes in the HIV genome show different rates of evolution. So P17 is really important for HIV structural integrity, so it doesn't change very much over several years. And then V3 helps the virion bind to the host cell, to the human host cell. That changes a lot as the immune system starts to recognize the virus and fight against it. V3 is constantly changing to help the virus continue to attack the host. Viruses and other pathogens maintain large population sizes, and large population sizes mean that you're going to get lots of mutations, lots of genetic variation, and with that variation, adaptation. So all of these things combine for rapid evolution, and just like us, the goal of these pathogens is to survive and reproduce. So what kinds of traits do pathogens generally evolve? The first that you've probably heard about is virulence. And virulence is kind of 2 things combined into one measure. It's how good a virus is at competing with other viruses or other pathogens, and then how good a pathogen is at spreading to a new host. And so this graph over here is showing you how these 2 things trade off, right? So competition within a host is going to select for higher virulence because you want to be able to outcompete other pathogens. But if your virulence is too high, you run the risk of killing your host. So transmission to new hosts is going to select against high virulence and go for low virulence. And so when you have strong competition within a host, you'll get a highly virulent pathogen, but if that pathogen really needs to come into contact with other hosts in order to reproduce, then you'll have selection for lower virulence. Pathogens also evolve to avoid the immune system of the host. That's why, for instance, influenza we need a new flu vaccine every year because influenza evolves new surface proteins, and those surface proteins are what our immune system uses to recognize influenza. And so flu is always evolving new surface proteins, and thus we are always making new vaccines. In general, we have put really strong selection on our bacterial pathogens in the form of antibiotics. And so this is a graph showing you in orange when a antibiotic was first introduced, in brown when resistance was first observed. And you can see that in general, resistance pops up very soon after an antibiotic is first used in a medical context. And this is because the pathogens have a choice. They can die or they can resist. And if they don't die in the face of the antibiotic, that means that they probably have some ability to resist the antibiotic, and they can pass that ability on to their offspring. Here's an example of evolution of resistance in a tuberculosis patient. So this is a single patient who was treated with a number of antibiotics. And you can see here there's 2 antibiotics to start, and after 8 months, the tuberculosis bacteria had evolved mutations that conferred resistance to both of those drugs. Then after 8 months, they switched to these 2 drugs, and then a 3rd, 4th, and 5th. So these kind of drug cocktail is very common. It slows down evolution a little bit because the bacteria can't fight all of these drugs at the same time. But you can see that it still managed to evolve resistance. And so by the time you get out here, where the patient is starting to have parts of their lung removed to remove the infection, you end up with a completely resistant tuberculosis at this point. So natural selection is slow, and it's particularly slow for humans. And the reason why is our generation time. So it's only as fast as the generation time of the organism. It takes time for individuals to grow up, reproduce, pass on their traits, and for nature to favor those traits. So a human generation time is roughly 22 to 33 years. We'll kind of think about it as 25 years going forward just to make it easy on ourselves. But we're changing our environment much, much faster than that. And so this graph over here on the right is showing you 2 major transitions in human evolutionary history. The first was about 10,000 years ago, and it was an agricultural revolution. We stopped hunting and gathering, and we started planting and domesticating plants and animals. And so you end up with a major shift in our physiology and behavior here. And then about 200 years ago, we had the Industrial Revolution. And so you end up with cities and more of a built environment. You have all of the good things about Industrial Revolution, like more efficient processes and clean water and things like that. But we'll talk a little bit about why there are some issues here too. And so as a result of these 2 major transitions, we have a lot of traits in our bodies and in our health that are adapted to environments that we don't live in anymore. And what this means is that we experience mismatch. And so I have 3 examples that fit this kind of idea of mismatch. And the first is anxiety, which we'll talk about in a second. Second is diet, obesity, and type 2 diabetes. And third is asthma and autoimmune diseases. So for anxiety, think about pre-agricultural revolution, so pre-10,000 years ago. Humans lived all over the world. We were hunter-gatherers, and so we spent a lot of our time moving around, trying to find food. We didn't stay in one place for very long. And before that, so about 120,000 years ago, humans were restricted to Africa. So not only were we hunter-gatherers, but we lived on the African savanna. And then much, much further back, about 7 million years ago, our common ancestor with chimpanzees lived in African rainforests. And so those are the environments that we have actually evolved in and adapted to. And in those environments, there were plenty of things to be afraid of, and a little anxiety, checking over your shoulder, having a phobia of snakes or spiders, all of these things kept you alive, right? They kept you alive long enough to reproduce. And so today, when we don't have snakes in our everyday environment, we don't have killer spiders in our everyday environment, there's very slim chance we're going to get attacked by lions in the middle of Boston. We have all of these anxieties that our body is like used to looking out for, but there's nothing there anymore. We've gotten rid of all of these threats. And so anxiety is a mismatch. It's a symptom of an environment that was much more dangerous and today is not. Similarly, for diet, obesity, and type 2 diabetes, our first agricultural revolution was about 10,000 years ago, and it led to a lot of changes in our genes that helped us better digest our new sources of food. So, for instance, lactose tolerance evolved. We evolved the ability to digest certain starches and grains, and this was new because we didn't eat those before 10,000 years ago. More recently, our diet has shifted again, so we have modern farming practices, industrial food processing, and we've seen a rise in cheap, calorically dense foods. And these cheap, calorically dense foods play on our brain's reward systems. And the reason they're able to do that is because 100,000 years ago, sweet, fatty foods were relatively rare. And so if humans found them, the brain rewarded them for eating them because they were really valuable if they were found and eaten. And so we have in our bodies this kind of attraction to sweet and fatty foods. They taste good. And that evolved so that we wouldn't pass up those foods in nature. The problem is we now have a modern diet that is very, very heavy in those foods, and our physiology is not adapted to that high caloric intake. So we have a mismatched physiology, and this is only one piece of the puzzle. So part of this puzzle is this mismatched physiology. Part of it, though, is something we're only just beginning to understand, thinking about epigenetics. And so epigenetics are things above the gene level that can be passed on. And we are starting to understand these as we look back at history and study multiple generations of people. And so this example is from the Dutch hunger winter at the end of World War II. And so in World War II, the Nazis blocked food shipments to Holland over the winter of 1944 to 1945. And in that winter, you had a number of pregnant women who experienced famine conditions. And so they had less than 1,000 calories per day. And they experienced these famine conditions at different stages of pregnancy. And so that's what this graph up here is showing you. You have people who were born before the famine. You have people who were born or conceived after the famine. And then you have people who were late stage pregnancy at the beginning of the famine, mid-late stage pregnancy at the famine, and then the whole pregnancy during the famine. And if you look at those children and their grandchildren, and you look at them as adults, you find a number of illnesses that they are much more likely to have than babies who were born before the famine or conceived after. So when these children grew up, they were much more likely to have a wide variety of health problems, including high blood glucose, high blood insulin, high body mass index, high rates of coronary heart disease, high levels of obstructive airway diseases, and generally poor health. They even died at a higher rate than children born before or conceived after the famine. And so the question is, how could this possibly be adaptive? How could this possibly be beneficial? Well, in a hunter-gatherer environment, if your mom is starving, then that means that probably the environment she's in doesn't have a lot of resources, and it's to your benefit to be able to take in and maximize any calories you get. And so the assumption is that the baby is being born into a very similar resource environment to the mother. And that's how nature has favored our traits. However, in this case, it was a very extreme environment that was very short-lived, and afterwards they went back to normal. They had normal diets, but that physiology had been, the switch had been flipped. And so they were in famine mode, and they were in famine mode for the rest of their lives, even though their environment was not a famine environment. So the third example of mismatch is asthma and autoimmune diseases. And this is a really interesting one to me. I have an autoimmune disease. I have celiac disease, which means that my body attacks gluten. It also means that when my body attacks gluten, it attacks itself. And so that's why it's an autoimmune disease. You're having an immune response to your own cells. And so prior to modern hygiene, prior to antibiotics, clean water, we were constantly infected with things. Some of these things were deadly, like measles. Some of them were just annoyances. And a lot of them were actually beneficial, like our gut and skin microbes. But our immune systems evolved to deal with these things. They evolved to respond to what are known as our old friends, microbes and parasites that we used to run into all the time, but have since gotten rid of. And so what we've seen is that as society has industrialized and cleaned up the water, cleaned up modern hygiene, added antibiotics, we have this kind of twitchy immune system. It's an immune system that overreacts to otherwise harmless foreign substances like pollen or peanuts or something else you're allergic to. And this can become very extreme to the point of attacking your own cells, like in an autoimmune disorder. And so these graphs here show you that as these infectious diseases have declined over time, from 1950 to 2000, the rise in autoimmune diseases and asthma has happened over the same time period. So infectious diseases gone down, autoimmune diseases and asthma have gone up. And here's another really great example. So this part of the world, so Finland is the country on the left here, and then this section of Russia have two very different environments. Finland is very modernized and very clean, and Russia is a little bit more developing, and has a poor economy and poorer people. And so if you look at the rates of type 1 diabetes, they're much higher in Finland in this kind of clean environment compared to Karelia in Russia, where you have a lot more pathogens, a lot more parasites attacking people, and so you end up with less autoimmune diseases. And so what this means is that we have this kind of seesaw here, where on either side we have allergies and non-allergies, and so our genes are responsible here, and our environment triggers us on one side or the other. And so as we modernize, have smaller families, live in affluent urban homes, have stable intestinal gut microbes, use antibiotics, have low worm burden, good sanitation, low oral fecal burden, we end up with more and more allergic disorders. In developing countries where they still have larger families, rural homes, they're exposed to livestock, they have variable and transient microflora, low antibiotic use, but a lot of people have worms, poor sanitation, high oral fecal burden. These aren't great things, but they don't experience allergies and autoimmune diseases to the level that we do. So mismatch is not the only thing going on, and selection being slow is not the only reason why we get sick. Selection also can't solve all problems, and so we often face trade-offs. And one of the best ways to think about trade-offs is to think about it in terms of a budget, right? You have a certain amount of money that you make, and you can spend that money on essentials, things that you need to survive, and extras, things that you don't need but make life worth living, right? And so if we were to think about our household budget, think about how much money we make working jobs, bringing that home, Some of it goes to paying for our homes, whether it's a house or an apartment or a condo. You have to pay some form of rent. Then you have to buy food. You have to pay for water, electricity, for the internet. You generally need a car to get around so that you can get these things or go to your job. And in today's world, you definitely need a cell phone as part of how you're reachable by friends, by coworkers, a lot of things that we do on our phone these days. This doesn't include extras. And so once you've spent the majority of your budget on these essentials, you don't have as much money left over to spend on your extras. And extras include things like your pets, eating out, going on trips, going to sporting events and other major events. So we can take this trade-off model, this budget model, and think about it in terms of our biology and our evolutionary history. And so when we start thinking about this in terms of our biology, now our budget or our currency is energy from resources, so energy from food and water. And we put a lot of that energy from food and water towards growth and survival. So making sure that we grow up healthy and strong and historically have been able to escape predators. What we don't spend on growth and survival, we put towards reproduction, so towards having children. Now, if we think about when we're sick, so this is your biological budget. When you're sick, everything gets shoved over here. Reproduction, growth, survival gets downplayed so that you can spend energy on immune function. And so your energy is allocated to your immune response, to all of those white blood cells that help fight off disease. And so this means that when you're sick, you might experience some symptoms like fever, fatigue, anorexia, reduced libido. All of these are things that we tend to experience because we don't have the energy to put towards reproduction, growth, and survival. We're just putting it towards immune function. So trade-offs are one way in which selection can't solve all problems. Constraint is another one. And so evolutionary constraint refers to the idea that selection can only tinker with structures that already exist. And the evolutionary history of an organism will constrain the solutions to problems. And so, for instance, in vertebrates, we have a really fantastic eye, right? We're able to see things very clearly. We have a lens, we have photoreceptor cells, we see in color. But we have one major drawback to our eye, which is that all of our photoreceptor cells are actually pointing backwards. And this means that the nerves that take those messages from our eye cells, from our photoreceptor cells back to the brain for processing, collect at the back of our eye and form a blind spot. And so this spot where the optic nerve leaves the eyeball and heads towards the brain, there's actually no photoreception going on because all of your nerve bundles are there. Compare that to the cephalopod eye, so this octopus eye, where all the photoreceptor cells face forwards and the nerves run behind it. And so there is no blind spot because there are photoreceptor cells right here where the nerves collect in the back to go back to the brain. And so even though we have very similar eyes, our eyes evolved with this flaw, this blind spot, while cephalopods don't have that. And so it's just how we evolved, and it's a constraint that we have that cephalopods don't. And there are lots of those types of constraint in our bodies and in other organisms as well. So, as we discussed at the beginning of this video, we often misunderstand what selection is actually shaping. And we talked about in the last video antagonistic pleiotropy, this early life advantage with a late life cost. Other examples of this include cancer and Huntington's disease and other late life diseases. Often those symptoms that are so annoying, fever, cough, sneeze, diarrhea, vomiting, they're so annoying, sometimes they're even life-threatening. So if you're super dehydrated because of your fever or because of diarrhea, that can be very dangerous. But generally, they're evolved. They actually evolved to help you get rid of the pathogen. So your fever is part of how your body makes your environment a bad environment for the pathogen to live in. Sneezing, coughing, vomiting, diarrhea, these are all ways that we expel pathogens from our body. So often we misunderstand what selection is actually shaping, and we often treat symptoms in a way that makes recovery slower and more difficult. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about current events and think a little bit about coronavirus, since it's dominated our lives for the last year. And, we know that coronaviruses are really common in nature. They're particularly common in bats. And new human viruses in general, about 60% of our new viruses come from animal species. So this is known as spillover. And one of the books that I highly recommend for a background reading on this topic is by David Quammen, and it's called Spillover. And usually most spillover events, nothing comes of them, right? And so in this diagram here, which is from a video on how spillover works, you have the original virus and it jumps into humans, and most of the time it goes extinct, right? And so it's a dead end. Either it doesn't actually hurt the person, or it kills that person without getting transmitted. And only every so often does that virus have a mutation that allows it to form an outbreak in people. And so we think that SARS-CoV-2, which is what causes COVID-19, is a case of spillover. In particular, we know that other coronaviruses were bat viruses, and they jumped to humans via intermediate hosts. And so in 2002, we had SARS-CoV-1, which jumped from bats to civets to humans. And the civet is kind of like this creature here. It's kind of like a cross between a cat and a monkey. It's an interesting creature. And then in 2012, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, or MERS, jumped from bats to camels to humans. And in 2020, a preliminary report from the Coronavirus Study Group suggests that SARS-CoV-2 is also a bat virus. At this point, we still don't know if there's an intermediate host. This is something that's really hard to detect after the fact, and we probably won't know for several years. So we didn't, for instance, conclusively link civets to SARS-1 until 5 or 6 years after the SARS-1 outbreak. But these trees over here are showing you where SARS-CoV-2 is in relation to other bat coronaviruses. And so it is definitely a bat virus to start. And so, as we learn more about coronavirus and as we come out of the pandemic, we're going to reveal a lot more information about how we should approach these new diseases. And I want to leave you with some ideas here. So there was a quote in 1975 by Theodore Dobzhansky, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." And I would argue that this is true for medicine. Nothing in medicine makes sense except in the light of evolution. And I didn't talk about everything that gets covered in a Darwinian medicine or evolutionary medicine course. Things that I kind of skipped over: cancer, vaccine development, vector control like mosquito control, and infectious disease ecology, mental illness. For cancer and mental illness, there are two really good books that I recommend: The Emperor of All Maladies by Siddhartha Mukherjee and Good Reasons for Bad Feelings by Randy Ness. I'd like to acknowledge my dad for always talking science with me, even before I really understood what we were talking about. The founders of Darwinian medicine, including George Williams and Randy Ness. And I should note that I did my PhD at Stony Brook University, where George Williams was a professor for many years. And in my PhD work, I worked with 3 professors who really had a passion for all things Darwin and evolutionary medicine: Dr. Michael Bell, Dr. Doug Fatima, and Dr. Massimo Pigliucci. And at Bridgewater, I've taught Darwinian medicine 5 times, including this spring semester. And I love teaching this class and having, 5 semesters of stimulating discussion with my students on these topics is really useful. A lot of the figures from this talk are from Evolutionary Medicine and Evolution Making Sense of Life. And Darwin Day at Bridgewater State is supported by CASE, the Center for the Advancement of STEM Education, the Department of Biological Sciences, and the Bartlett College of Science and Math. And I hope to see you soon on Zoom, where we'll have some question and answer session. Thanks. Bye.